Throughout 2025, central banks across the world executed a series of moves that should have dominated headlines everywhere. They didn't. 9 of the 10 most powerful central banks cut interest rates 32 times in 12 months. The Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet again after spending years shrinking it. The Bank of Japan raised rates for the first time in 3 decades. Poland bought 95 tons of gold in 11 months. China restructured its entire digital currency framework. And in December, the Federal Reserve's policy meeting ended with 3 dissenting votes, the highest level of internal disagreement in 6 years. None of this happened by accident. These aren't isolated decisions made by independent institutions responding to local conditions. This is coordination. This is preparation. And the fact that it's happening simultaneously across every major economy tells you something they won't say out loud. They see what's coming. Let's start with what nobody's talking about. Central banks now hold more gold than US Treasuries for the first time since 1996. Think about what that means. For nearly 30 years, the safest, most liquid asset in the world was US government debt. That was the anchor. That was the reserve. Now it's been replaced by a metal that doesn't pay interest, doesn't generate yield, and hasn't been the foundation of the monetary system since 1971. Why would central banks make that switch unless they believed the system built on treasuries was becoming unstable? From 2022 to 2024, central banks purchased 3,220 tons of gold. That's double what they bought from 2014 to 2016. In 2022 alone, purchases spiked 140% year over year to over 1,000 metric tons. The trigger was Russia. When Western governments seized Russian reserves after the Ukraine invasion, every central bank without full geopolitical alignment with the West realized something terrifying. Your reserves aren't safe if they're held in someone else's system, so they started taking physical delivery. Poland didn't just buy gold, they repatriated it, bringing it home to vaults they control. 28% of Poland's reserves are now gold. Singapore, India, Turkey, all loading up. China added reserves every month through 2024. And here's the detail that should unsettle you. 95% of central banks surveyed expect this trend to continue. 43% plan to increase their own gold holdings. 0, not 1, expect a decline. That's not diversification. That's a vote of no confidence in the existing reserve system. Now let's talk about what happened with interest rates. In 2025, central banks delivered 850 basis points of rate cuts across 32 separate decisions. That's the most cuts since 2008 and the largest scale of easing since 2009. The Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, Bank of England, plus Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, all cutting together. Coordinated easing like this adds fuel to the economy. It's supposed to prevent recession, stabilize growth, keep things moving. But coordination only happens when the risk is systemic. When one country cuts rates alone, it's a local issue. When 9 major central banks cut together, they're responding to something bigger than any single economy. And then the coordination broke. By the end of 2025, most central banks stopped cutting and adopted hawkish stances. The Bank of Japan did the opposite, raising rates to 0.75%, the highest level since 1995. Japan had been the last holdout, the final source of cheap money in the global system. That era just ended. Japan is the world's largest net creditor with $3.66 trillion in foreign investments. For years, Japanese institutions poured money into US treasuries and European bonds because rates at home were 0. Now Japanese rates are rising. That flow reverses. Capital that used to leave Japan and support foreign debt markets starts staying home. And the countries that depended on that capital, the ones running massive deficits, suddenly face a funding problem. The United States is one of those countries. Here's where it gets more revealing. In December, the Federal Reserve cut rates by 25 basis points for the third consecutive meeting. But the vote wasn't unanimous. 3 members dissented. 1 wanted a 50 basis point cut. 2 wanted no cut at all. 6 non-voting members also preferred holding rates steady. That level of disagreement tells you the data is no longer clear. The path forward is no longer obvious. The people inside the room can't agree on what's happening or what to do about it. And when central bankers can't agree, it means the models are breaking down. At the same time, the Fed announced it would start expanding its balance sheet again, buying $40 billion in short-term treasuries every month. They'd spent years shrinking the balance sheet, reversing the money printing from the pandemic. Now they're growing it again. Why? Because the treasury market showed stress. Repo rates spiked. Liquidity dried up during routine auctions. The standing repo facility saw increased use. These are technical signals that the safest, most liquid market in the world isn't functioning correctly. And the only way to keep it stable is for the Fed to step in as buyer of last resort. Again, meanwhile, China just overhauled its digital currency system. Starting January 1st, 2026, the digital yuan transitions from a cash model to a deposit money model. It becomes an account-based instrument, a liability of commercial banks under central bank oversight, compatible with distributed ledger technology. That's not an upgrade, that's infrastructure for a parallel monetary system. Why would China build that now? Because it allows central bank control over every transaction. Programmable money, expiration dates, geographic limits, negative interest rates. The infrastructure exists to force economic behavior. If people stop spending, you can make their money disappear unless they use it. If capital tries to flee, you can restrict where it goes. This isn't a payment upgrade. It's a control system ready to activate when the next crisis hits. And then there's the gold. In 2025, central banks bought 634 tons of gold. Poland added 95 tons through November, bringing their total to 543 tons. That's 28% of their entire reserves now held in physical gold. Not paper contracts, physical metal. A survey of central bankers revealed that 95% expect continued global gold purchases over the next 12 months. 43% plan to increase their own holdings. 0 respondents anticipated any decline. From 2022 to 2024, central banks purchased 3,220 tons. Compare that to 2014 through 2016, when they bought 1,576 tons. They've doubled their buying pace. And here's the detail that matters most. For the first time since 1996, central banks now hold more gold than US Treasuries. That shift began in earnest after Russian reserves were frozen in 2022. Countries with less alignment to the West watched that happen and drew a simple conclusion. Any asset held in another country's system can be seized. Gold held in your own vault cannot. The World Gold Council explicitly identifies diversification away from US assets as the primary driver. This isn't portfolio adjustment. It's systematic de-dollarization. 36,200 tons of gold now sit in central bank vaults globally, representing nearly 20% of official reserves. That's up from 15% at the end of 2023. Gold is on pace to supplant US Treasuries as the dominant reserve asset. The very foundation of dollar dominance is eroding, and central banks are preparing for what comes after. JP Morgan forecasts gold hitting $5,000 per ounce by the end of 2026, climbing toward $5,400 by late 2027. Why? Because the trends driving this aren't exhausted. They're accelerating. When reserve diversification reaches critical mass, when enough central banks hold gold instead of dollars, the feedback loop intensifies. Each country that shifts makes holding dollars slightly less necessary for everyone else. And once the perception changes, once holding dollars feels riskier than diversifying, the dam breaks. Now overlay what's happening in currency markets. 23% of China's cross-border transactions now settle in yuan, up from 0 in 2010. The BRICS nations are developing alternative payment systems. Saudi Arabia accepts yuan for oil. These aren't symbolic gestures. They're infrastructure for a world where the dollar isn't required for global trade. The Bank for International Settlements published a report in December 2023 titled The Future Monetary System. Page 47 contains this statement. Central banks should prepare for scenarios where multiple reserve currencies operate simultaneously. That's not speculation. That's acknowledgement. They know dollar dominance is ending. The only question is how fast and how chaotic the transition becomes. When the US loses the ability to print money and have other countries hold it, that $36 trillion in debt becomes an immediate crisis. We can't export inflation anymore. We can't fund deficits by selling bonds to foreign central banks who need dollars for trade. The entire system that's allowed America to borrow without consequence for 50 years disappears. And the infrastructure being built right now, the swap lines, the digital currencies, the emergency lending facilities, all of it is designed to maintain control during that transition. But there's a problem. Policy divergence is already creating stress. When central banks move together, the system stays balanced. When they diverge, capital flows become unpredictable. Japan raising rates while the Fed cuts creates pressure. Europe holding steady while America eases creates imbalances. The linkages in the global financial system are tight. The Fed cannot move too far from other central banks without feeling ill effects. And those effects show up in the places nobody's watching until it's too late. Treasury auctions that fail, repo markets that freeze, currency swaps that spike in cost. These are the early warnings. The system is already straining under the divergence. That's why coordination happened in 2025. 9 central banks cutting together wasn't coincidence. It was necessity. They needed to act in unison because the alternative was disorderly breakdown. But coordination only works if everyone agrees on the path forward. And the Fed's internal divisions show that agreement is fracturing. When 3 out of 12 voting members dissent, when 6 non-voting members openly disagree, when the dot plot shows dispersed forecasts, it means the playbook isn't working anymore. The models that predicted outcomes for decades are breaking down. The data is contradictory. And when central bankers can't agree on what's happening, it's because what's happening doesn't fit the framework they've always used. Here's what they can't say publicly. The debt cannot be repaid. The Treasury market cannot function without Fed intervention. The dollar's reserve status is ending, and the transition will destroy the purchasing power of everyone holding cash, bonds, and fixed income. They can't say it, because the moment they do, the crisis accelerates. Foreign central banks dump treasuries. Depositors pull money from banks. Investors flee dollar assets. The very act of warning triggers the collapse. So they're trapped. They need to prepare without admitting why they're preparing. They need to coordinate without revealing what they're coordinating for. And they need to maintain confidence in a system they know is failing. That's why every action contradicts the narrative. They say inflation is under control while buying gold at record pace. They say the banking system is stable while building unlimited lending facilities. They say the dollar is strong while creating backup payment systems. The actions reveal what the words cannot. And if you understand the actions, you understand what's coming. Because this isn't about predictions. It's about patterns. And the pattern has already played out 3 times with perfect consistency. Spain believed silver made them invincible. They extended militarily, debased currency, borrowed endlessly, lost productive capacity, and collapsed within a century. Britain believed empire made them permanent. They extended militarily, abandoned gold backing, borrowed from America, lost the empire, and became a regional power within 50 years. The Soviet Union believed ideology made them inevitable. They extended militarily, printed rubles nobody wanted, couldn't feed their population, lost their satellites, and ceased to exist within 900 days. Each time, the pattern was identical. Each time, they believed they were exceptional. Each time, they were wrong. And now it's our turn. We've completed 5 of 7 stages: military overextension, currency debasement, debt spiral, loss of productive capacity, social decay. The final 2 stages are loss of reserve currency status and sudden collapse. We're not there yet, but the infrastructure being built tells you central banks believe we're close. In December 2025, the Federal Reserve began expanding its balance sheet again, $40 billion per month in treasury purchases. They stopped pretending quantitative tightening could continue. The repo markets were flashing warnings. The standing repo facility saw increased usage. Treasury auctions were showing stress, so they reversed course, not with fanfare, quietly, because admitting the Treasury market needs permanent life support would trigger the crisis they're trying to prevent. Meanwhile, the Bank of Japan did something it hasn't done in 30 years. They raised rates to 0.75%, the highest since 1995. For decades, Japan was the world's source of cheap money. Pension funds and insurers borrowed yen at 0% and bought foreign bonds, especially US treasuries. That flow is reversing. Japan is pulling capital home. And when trillions in Japanese money stops flowing into US debt markets, who fills the gap? Nobody. That's the problem. China is reducing treasury holdings. Japan is reversing. Saudi Arabia is diversifying. The traditional buyers are walking away. And central banks know it. That's why Poland added 95 tons of gold in 2025, bringing their reserves to 28% gold. That's why 95% of central banks surveyed expect continued gold accumulation in 2026. That's why central banks now hold more gold than US treasuries for the first time since 1996. This isn't random. It's systematic de-dollarization, and it's accelerating. China just shifted their digital yuan to a deposit-based model. Effective January 1st, 2026, the ECNY became an account-based payment instrument compatible with distributed ledger technology, performing core monetary functions, including cross-border payments. Translation: they built the infrastructure to bypass the dollar in international trade. This is what Stage 6 looks like. Not dramatic announcements, just quiet infrastructure changes that make dollar dependence optional instead of mandatory. And when enough countries have that option, they'll use it. Because holding dollars means holding US debt. And holding US debt means trusting that 36 trillion will be repaid in currency that maintains value. Nobody believes that anymore, not even the central banks coordinating to keep the system functioning. That's why they issued unified support for Federal Reserve leadership stability in January 2026. When central banks coordinate public messaging about leadership and independence, it's because confidence has become the critical variable. They're defending credibility because credibility is all that's left. The fundamentals don't support the system anymore. The math doesn't work. The debt cannot be serviced at market rates. The deficits cannot be funded without money printing. The currency cannot maintain value under those conditions. But as long as everyone believes it's stable, it functions. The moment belief breaks, the system breaks. And belief is fracturing. You can see it in the Fed's internal divisions. 3 dissents in December. 6 additional members disagreeing off the record. Dot plots showing dispersed forecasts. When the people running the system can't agree on what's happening, it's because their models are breaking down. The relationships that held for decades aren't holding anymore. That's what happens at inflection points. The old rules stop working before the new rules become clear. And in that gap, systems collapse. Spain took 80 years. Britain took 40. The Soviet Union took 900 days. How long do we have? Nobody knows. But the pattern says When it starts, it accelerates. And the infrastructure being built right now, the swap lines, the emergency facilities, the digital currencies, the gold accumulation, all of it is designed for one purpose: control during transition. Because central banks have studied Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. They know how this ends. They're just trying to manage the descent instead of freefall. But managing collapse is still collapse, just slower, more controlled, more orderly. The outcome doesn't change, only the speed. And for anyone holding dollars, bonds, or fixed income when the transition accelerates, slow collapse still means destroyed purchasing power. The pattern doesn't care about intentions. It cares about mathematics. And the mathematics say the debt cannot be repaid, the currency cannot hold value, and the reserve status cannot be maintained. Central banks are preparing for exactly that. They're just not telling you. So what does all this mean for you? It means we're living through a transition that's already decided. The central banks have made their choice. They'll devalue currency rather than default on debt. They'll sacrifice purchasing power to maintain control. They'll coordinate internationally to manage the descent. The winners will be those holding assets that preserve value when currencies fail. Hard assets, productive businesses, commodities, gold. The people positioned before the transition becomes obvious. The losers will be savers in dollars, euros, yen, pounds. Anyone holding cash or bonds denominated in currencies being devalued to manage unpayable debts, pension funds, retirees on fixed income, middle-class workers whose wages lag inflation. This isn't speculation. It's what happened in Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The pattern plays out the same way because the mathematics are the same. Debts that cannot be repaid get inflated away. Reserve currencies that lose credibility get replaced. Empires that overextend collapse. The only variable is timing. And the actions of central banks in 2025 tell you they believe timing is compressing. You don't need them to announce it. You can see it in what they're doing when they think nobody's watching. Building infrastructure, accumulating gold, coordinating across borders, preparing for scenarios they won't name publicly. The question isn't whether this happens. The question is whether you'll be positioned correctly when it does. Because the moment they stop saying everything is fine, it's already too late. Recognition always comes after the opportunity to prepare has closed. That's how patterns work. They're invisible until they're obvious. And by the time they're obvious, the outcome is already determined.